Hello, I am Jarett, and this is my presentation on Constantine the Great. Constantine, or Flavius Valerius Constantus, as he is known in Latin, was born February 27th, probably around the year 272 AD, although the exact date is not known. He was born in modern-day Serbia, but at the time it was known as the Roman province of Moesia. Moesia, geographically, has the Balkans mountain range running through it and the Danube River cutting across it. At the time of Constantine's birth, the people of Moesia had been under Roman rule for more than 300 years. So Constantine may have appeared non-Roman to us, coming from Serbia, but his province had been considered Roman territory for more than a millennia. Constantine grew up in relative poverty for a future Roman emperor. His mother, Helena, was a commoner, and perhaps these humble beginnings would lead him to have sympathy for a religion like Christianity, in which poverty is seen as a virtue. In the year 289, Constantine's father left his mother, Helena. He did this because he had a rising in social status. He no longer could be married to a commoner woman. The effect this must have had on a 17-year-old Constantine is huge. He was no longer his father's legitimate son. His father then married the stepdaughter of Maximian, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Then, in what might have been an attempt to remove Constantine from the picture, Constantine's father sent him to the court of Diocletian, the Eastern Roman emperor at the time. A pretty smart move, sending his angry son all the way across to the Eastern Roman Empire where he could do him no harm. At the court of Diocletian, Constantine would learn Latin and Greek, and would be educated in Greek philosophy. He would likely also have witnessed the persecution of many Christians, as Diocletian was infamous for his hatred of this religious group. Now that we have looked at Constantine's early years, I would like to look at Constantine's parents. Constantine was born to Flavius Constantus and Helena. His father, Flavius Constantus, was an Illyrian army officer from low-birth parents. He quickly rose up through the ranks of the Roman army to the position of Protectus Augusti Nostra under Emperor Aurelian. Protectus Augusti Nostra, translated directly, means protector of our Augustus, Caesar Augustus being widely considered the first Roman emperor. This title basically means protector of our emperor. This rank was usually held by officers that had distinguished themselves and had the emperor's favor. The members of this group tended to form more of a guild than a military unit. This office is not to be confused with the Praetorian Guard, the direct bodyguards of the emperor. It was very unusual that someone of such low birth, like Constantus, was able to rise so high. He assisted then Roman Emperor Aurelian by putting down uprisings in the Roman provinces of Syria and Egypt. Because of these actions, Constantus had the favor of Aurelian, and it seemed like his career was on a fast track, until Emperor Aurelian was murdered while his army was encamped. Members of his Praetorian Guard surrounded and stabbed Aurelian. This sent shockwaves throughout the empire, and Constantus, whose career had just seemed so bright, was now in jeopardy. Being an extremely capable officer, you might believe that this may have proved an invaluable skill, but few were willing to overlook the fact of his low birth. But another emperor would soon rise to power, one who would realize the talent of Constantus. His name was Diocletian. Diocletian would rise to power in 284. Seeing the fate and assassinations that befell his predecessor, Diocletian was wary of his Roman military staff and his generals, and many of Rome's governors. So Diocletian did a move that surprised everyone. He promoted Constantus to the position of governor for the Roman province of Dalmatia. Diocletian's reason for doing this is unclear, but to me it seems like Diocletian wanted someone around him that was completely loyal to him. This way he could avoid the fate of past emperors. To understand in part why someone with such low birth was able to rise so high, you would have to understand the political climate of the period. Rome in this period was smack dab in the middle of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Most historians say the crisis of the 3rd century began in 235. This is a time of great military, political, economic, and social collapse in Rome, characterized by barbarian invasions, civil wars, peasant rebellions, and political instability. And would see in total 21 emperors seize power in 40 years. The 3rd century crisis began with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander in the year 235. Severus Alexander was an emperor from the Severian dynasty, a Roman dynasty that managed to stay in power through military might. Ironically, it was those same military advisors that would later assassinate him. With the assassination of Alexander, the 3rd century crisis was in full swing. The 3rd century crisis would be spurred on by 3 main problems: crippling inflation, no reliable way of succession, and an empire with borders far too long to protect. Now, there being 24 emperors in 5 years is way too many for me to give a synopsis of all, so I'll try my best to keep it brief. After the assassination of Severus Alexander by his military generals, those very same generals would appoint Maximian. It's obvious why they would appoint Maximian. He was a fellow general. But he had no political experience, and this would be a common theme in the 3rd century crisis that would continue to worsen the crisis, because these military generals that would become emperors were very incompetent rulers due to a lack of political savvy and experience. Maximus Thrax would only rule for 3 years before being assassinated by his troops, as they were tired of almost constant warfare. They were in constant warfare because Rome was simply too big. They could not defend their borders from all types of groups of people. Take note, as this is another emperor assassinated by his troops. Maximus Thrax never even set foot in Rome. This shows the weakening power and authority of the city. The next 2 emperors were co-rulers, father and son. If you think this story is heartwarming, just wait. Gordian I and Gordian II took part in the plot to assassinate Maximus Thrax. Gordian II was killed fighting what was remaining of Maximus's forces, and Gordian I, hearing the news of his son's death, decided to take his own life. In total, they only ruled 3 months. Part of the problem was these emperors relied too heavily on the military. According to the Historia Journal, Maximus entrenched himself with a common soldier, spent most of his time training soldiers, and was almost illiterate. This is not good emperor material. As these military emperors were chosen by the military, they were widely despised by the nobility. And there lies the problem. To rule, you need the support of the nobility, or else you're going to face constant uprisings. The next rulers were co-rulers as well. Their names were Pappinus and Balbinus. They were appointed by the Senate after the word of the defeat of Gordarian I and II. At the time, the nobility supported the Senate picking the emperors because the nobility mainly made up the Senate. But the Praetorian Guards, the military guards designed to protect the emperors, resented having to protect an emperor chosen by the Senate and not the military. So the Praetorian Guards killed both the co-emperors while they slept. They ruled just 3 months. The Praetorian Guards had just killed their third emperor actually, but 2 sets of emperors. Now you can understand some of the turmoil in the 3rd century. In the first 3 years we have looked at in the crisis, 6 emperors have been killed. 2 by their own military, 2 by their own guards, 1 by death in battle, and 1 by suicide. This all happened in 3 years, a time span of not even a full presidential term for our modern world. 18 other emperors would hold this position in 42 years. I am going to give the rundown of each emperor and how long they ruled for and their cause of death. After Balbinus and Pappinus came Gordian III, who ruled for 6 years before being killed by his own soldiers. Then came Philip the Arab. He was killed in battle by his successor Decius. He ruled for only 5 years. Then came Decius. He made his son co-emperor, hoping that this would fix the succession problem. But then both died in battle. He ruled for only 3 years. Then came Hostilian, a general under Decius. Hostilian ruled for 2 years and was assassinated by his own troops. Then came Gallius, who ruled for 2 years before being assassinated by his troops. Then came Alamalius, a general under Gallius, who ruled for 2 months before being assassinated. Then came Valerian. He ruled for 7 years before he was captured in a border war with the Sassanids, aka the successor state to the Persians. Valerian was the only emperor ever to be captured, and depending on how the story goes, he was either forced to drink hot gold or flayed alive. Some accounts even say his body was stuffed and displayed at the court of the Persians. Next came Gallienus, who would rule for 15 years. He installed several military reforms, but his death was plotted in a conspiracy involving future Emperor Aurelian and his own military. Then came Claudius, who ruled for 2 years and defeated a Gothic invasion into Roman territory before dying of plague. Then came Quintillus, the brother of Claudius, who reigned for only 6 months before being assassinated by, once again, Aurelian. From what you have seen, you wouldn't be wrong to assume you are seeing the end of the Roman Empire. But still, the Roman Empire would last for over 200 years. That is because 2 emperors would come along that would stitch the empire back together. The first was Aurelian. After managing to assassinate his way to the top, Aurelian would take power next. And you wouldn't be mistaken for thinking that Aurelian seemed like every other bloodthirsty king before him. After all, he assassinated 2 other people to get the crown. But then, the Roman people would soon find out Aurelian was different in one aspect. He was a cunning tactician. Aurelian, or as he was known in Latin, Lucius Domitius Aurelius, was a cavalry officer under Gallius. Aurelian arranged Gallius's death with the leader of the Roman military, whom would succeed Gallius when he died. This plan worked flawlessly, and Aurelian was promoted to magistrate equitum, which was basically the head of the Roman army, the same position that the emperor who took part in the assassination held. I shouldn't have to point out why this is a bad idea, to promote the person who just helped you assassinate another emperor to the highest position in the Roman military. So basically, you made him your successor, the guy who just assassinated someone for you. Not a great idea. What happened next was predictable. Aurelian arranged the assassination of this emperor. The Roman Empire Aurelian would come to rule was very different. The East was ruled by the Palmyran Empire, a splinter group off the Roman Empire. And in Western Europe, the former Roman provinces were ruled by Gauls. The crisis Aurelian inherited was more than just political instability and civil wars. In the early years of the empire, the state profited by reducing the gold and silver content of coins to allow them to be minted in greater number, thus making more money, says historian Lucas de Bois. As in a circumstance reminiscent to the Germans after World War I, more money does not mean the same value. Because the coins had started to be produced at a higher rate, there was less value for them. And because these coins had a lower silver and gold count, people hoarded the old coins because they had more precious material in them, making them more valuable. They hoarded these old materials because the precious material in the old coins were worth more than the new ones were, meaning there was no point in spending them. This created a massive inflation crisis, and the price of bread soared. Another problem in this time was the Roman Empire's borders. The Western Roman Empire saw frequent raids from Gallic tribes like the Vandals, Alumni, and Goths. The Roman Empire also split in 3 in this time period, into the Gallic Empire that would control most of modern-day France, and the Palmyran Empire that controls most of the Far East in places like Syria and Egypt. Another problem that afflicted this time period was outbreaks of the plague. Starting in 250, the plague lasted for 20 years and killed an estimated 5,000 people a day at its height. Together with these 3 factors, the industry, military, and population of the Roman Empire started to steeply decline, and constant civil wars only pushed this along. This is the political climate that Aurelian would inherit. Aurelian would set to unite the 3 halves of the Roman Empire again. He first set his sights on the Palmyran Empire, which had control over formerly Roman provinces. In 272, after one city after the other had surrendered to Aurelian, he was finally at the gates of Palmyra itself, which surrendered without a fight. Aurelian had now restored the Roman Empire's eastern borders. His sights then turned to the Gallic Empire in the north. Aurelian would meet their army at Champagne, in which was an easy victory. He now claimed the northern part of Rome as well. The Senate then gave him the title Restaurator Orbis, translated means restorer of the world. Aurelian also tried to institute coinage reform. He instituted a coin called the Antony, containing 5% silver. He thought standardizing the coin system would help reduce inflation, which to an extent it did, but people still hoarded the older, more valuable coins, and this made the new ones less valuable by comparison. Suppose the government in the US passed new money, electronic money. People would still prefer the old money because it is reliable and you know it's there. It's always going to hold the same value. The same concept applies to this. People liked the old coins because the amount of precious minerals in them ensured their value. Although his reforms weren't perfect, they were a start. But before he could continue on these reforms, Aurelian got word that one of the kings of Persia had died. This presented an opportunity to attack the Persian Empire while they were weak, and in 275 Aurelian set out for Persia. While on the march, Aurelian stopped to relieve himself. His Praetorian guards got unusually close to him, and before he knew it, he had been stabbed to death by his own guards. His death came too fast. He only ruled for 5 years, but in those years he stitched the empire back together and had promoted a lowly captain named Constantinus. He did this because Aurelian began to trust his military staff around him and wanted someone completely loyal to him. Little did Aurelian know that promoting Constantinus was the best act Aurelian had done. The next 11 years would see 6 emperors come and go, none ruling for long. But a new emperor would come to power in 284. His name was Diocletian, and he would set out to finish what Aurelian started. Diocletian's first reform was to restore civic order to the empire by removing the army from politics. He did this because he had seen how many other emperors the military had killed at this point. Diocletian then set to fixing the empire's succession problem. He had decided to share power with another. He selected a military man named Maximian, and together they split the empire in half. Although both halves would still be known as Rome, they were administered by these two men, and each man would have a designated successor, a co-ruler called a Caesar. Diocletian chose a man named Galerius, and Maximian chose Constantinus, the father of Constantine. To restart the economy, Diocletian instated a state-sponsored agriculture and building program. These policies were expensive, and so Diocletian constituted 2 new taxes, one taxes on land and one taxes on people's income. If these policies seem contradictory to you, it's because the idea of economics wasn't invented yet. Diocletian's economic reforms were largely a waste, as he set out to make building programs yet taxed the same people that he was trying to help recover. After ruling for 21 years, Diocletian would step down. His failing health had made him retire. He becomes one of the only Roman empires to ever retire, and he would leave his empire to his co-rulers. So Galerius and Constantinus would take over the empire. Constantinus would appoint his son as his Caesar, and Constantine the Great would become co-ruler of the Western Roman Empire. Constantinus and his son, whom had reunited, launched several campaigns in the Roman province of Britannium, defeating several tribes of Britannians. However, Constantinus would die at Aboracum, now called York, in the following year. The death of Constantinus would plunge the empire back into civil war, with Constantinus' son Constantine in the middle of it all. After Constantius' death, Constantine sent word back to Galerius informing him that his father had died, and that before his father died he had been declared his successor. Constantine requested to be recognized as his father's heir, and Galerius smartly did not flatly decline this offer, but instead granted Constantine the title of Caesar, which would make him a junior emperor. Constantine accepted this, and to understand why, you have to understand the position he was in. He was born to a poor family with no noble blood, and he wasn't even born to his father's actual wife. This lended him more legitimacy. Constantine, now being junior partner, got the provinces of Britain, Gaul, and Spain. Constantine's early rule in these provinces focused on building up infrastructure and fortifications. While ruling, he was very tolerant to Christians, even though he wasn't a Christian himself. In 310, Maximum, the father of Maximus, who had ruled with Constantius before Constantine, rose an army and rebelled against Constantine's authority. He announced that Constantine had died on campaign and attempted to usurp him. While Constantine was off on campaign, he heard the news of the rebellion, and he left his campaign and returned back. His army quickly surrounded a city Maximin had taken over. The loyal city opened their gates to Constantine, and Maximin was captured and forced to commit suicide. Maxus, hearing of his father's suicide, plotted to murder Constantine, and the man still holding the empire together, Galerius, had become very ill and seldom involved himself in politics. And as he died, the Tetrarchy came crumbling down with him. Maxus attacked Licinius and seized Asia Minor. Maxus then readied for war against Constantine. He stated his reasons were to avenge his father, although this reason is very dubious, as he had much time to avenge his father, and the timing seems very significant. Licinius, who had an alliance, defected to Constantine and married Constantine's sister. With this new alliance, Constantine wanted to strike at Maxentius, but his generals urged him not to, as Maxentius still possessed more men than Constantine. Constantine disregarded these warnings and crossed the Alps with a quarter of his army, about 40,000 men. The first major city Constantine encountered was Augusta Turnarum, modern-day Turin, Italy. The town had shut its gates to him, and a force of Maxentian cavalry met Constantine in the battle. Constantine quickly encircled this entire army with his own cavalry and massacred them. The city of Turin, who had just watched on, decided the best course of action was to open their gate towards him. The next few cities Constantine encountered all opened their gates and surrendered towards him. After these small cities in the Roman countryside had surrendered, one by one, at this point there was nothing standing between Constantine and Rome. Maxentian's plan was to fortify Rome and hopefully wait for Constantine to attack. Maxentian then ordered all bridges across the Tiber leading into Rome to be cut. Maxentian growing more and more unpopular with the city of Rome after the people had to endure many bread rations. Maxentian then felt like he had to engage Constantine or lose the city of Rome to complete rebellion. He then ordered a temporary bridge built across the Tiber to meet Constantine. Forcing a confrontation with Constantine, who had won every battle this far, may seem stupid, but Maxentian's troops still outnumbered Constantine's 2-1. Stepping back from the battle looming to talk about Constantine for a second, Constantine was a monotheist, worshipping the sun god Sol Invictus. However, before the battle that was about to take place, Constantine and his army saw a cross of light in the sky above the sun, with an inscription under it saying, in Latin, in hoc signo vicus, or translating to, in this sign conquer. That night Constantine had a dream in which Christ told him he should use the sign of the cross against his enemies. He even had his army mark this sign on their heads and shields. The sign they adopted was the Greek letter of Christ's initials, or Chi-Rho, meaning the CHRI in Christ. This account of this event comes from Eusebius, a biblical scholar writing a biography at the time of Constantine's death. This account is apparently first-hand from Constantine himself, but many historians and scientists do not believe this was a supernatural event. Instead, they believe that the light Constantine witnessed was a meteor impact. Jens Ormo, a Swedish geologist, and colleagues working in Italy believe that they have identified this crater. Radiocarbon dating puts it into the right time period for this event. While I find this theory plausible, I am skeptical that Constantine's account would not have mentioned an impact, or seeing this so-called cross fall to the ground and make an impact. Whether the cross in the sky as the event even happened is debated. The first account of the battle in 1315 mentions nothing about this event. It wasn't until a historian writing 2 years later mentioned it. Maxentius wants to force a battle because he believes it is the only way he can stop his populace from revolting, and he still has the numeral advantage. Constantine believes that higher power is on his side, and his followers are fanatical in their support for him, and believe he himself is a god, or at the very least he is God's chosen ruler. The two sides would clash at the Battle of Malavian Bridge. Maxentius had ordered his army to construct a temporary bridge and engage Constantine. Constantine, knowing he was outnumbered, stretched his force into a long, thin line, guarding the banks of the river. When the battle started, Maxentius's force was already across the Tiber River. Constantine's cavalry went around the army and hit his enemy in the back, and his cavalry quickly broke Maxentius's cavalry. This charge broke Maxentius's formation, and his men, fearing that they were surrounded, lost all organization. Constantine then ordered his infantry forward, and Maxentius's infantry quickly crumbled, and many of his soldiers were forced into the Tiber River, where they drowned. Maxentius then ordered a retreat across the river across their makeshift bridge. All organization was lost in this order, and every man fled for their lives. Maxentius was pushed into the river by his own troops and drowned, and his army fared no better, as their makeshift bridge soon collapsed, and the bulk of this once mighty army drowned. If Constantine wasn't a believer in Christianity before, he certainly was now. After this stunning victory, Constantine entered Rome itself to a jubilant crowd. Maxentius's body was recovered and beheaded. The head was dragged through the streets of Rome. The Senate, fearing ending up with the same fate as Maxentius, declared Constantine emperor. Constantine's rule then started with him disbanding the Praetorian Guard, something that he certainly learned from all the past Roman emperors' assassinations. Constantine not long after moved against the last remaining member of the Tetrarchy, Licinius, whom his sister was married to, and in 316 Constantine quickly defeated him, and later he was hung by Constantine. Constantine was now the sole emperor of all of Rome. Constantine then set to the task of reforming the military. He turned the governorship of a province into solely a political office and not a military office. This made future uprisings by influential Roman governors almost impossible, because they did not have the army to do so. This change would help keep stability in Rome. Constantine was also looking to keep stability in Rome in other ways. After the Civil War, the infrastructure of Rome had been quite torn apart. Despite several attempted building projects to help rebuild this infrastructure after near constant civil war, Constantine began to realize it was no longer practical to serve as the capital of Rome. Nicomedia, the place that Diocletian had chosen as his capital, was written off as well, being far too distant to govern the western half of the Roman Empire, being all the way in Turkey. not then called Anatolia. The ancient city of Troy was even considered, but soon Constantine would find a place to call his capital, and it would stand as the seat of power for Rome and the Byzantine Empire for almost 1,000 years. Before Constantine set off to found a new capital, he first set a religious policy regarding the Christians within the Roman Empire. Whether he was truly a Christian believer at this point or not is not known. This may have been just a way for Constantine to reward his followers. What is known is that under Constantine, all persecution of Christians stopped, and in 313 he met with the other religious leaders in Milan. This event is known as the Edict of Milan. This edict proclaimed that the Christians should be able to follow their religion without persecution. The Edict of Milan also applied to other religions in the empire. The edict also demanded that the Roman people right any wrong done to the Christian peoples. This act is sometimes referred to as the act that made Rome Christian, although that title is somewhat misleading, as this act did not officially set Rome as a Christian empire, but instead stopped the religious persecution of Christians within Rome. The Edict of Milan also restored the property of Christians that had been seized by the Roman Empire, and returned wealth to its rightful owners. It is thought that this decision was influenced by his mother, Helena, who was also a Christian. Though he still wasn't baptized at this time, after the Edict of Milan it is thought that he had fully converted to Christianity, as he built churches and appointed Christians to high positions in the empire. But Constantine still wasn't baptized. He wished to wait until he was on his deathbed so he could be absolved of any sins he could make. Constantine set off to find a new capital, as Rome was sliding further into decay. He also wanted a new capital that was closer to the Sassanids in the east. This made defending the border easier. He picked Byzantium for several factors. Byzantium, like the picture above shows, was situated between the Bosphorus Strait, a very easily defensible location because if any army tried to attack Byzantium, they would have to cross the Bosphorus Strait. Byzantium was very near the sea. It also had a sister city that stretched on the opposite banks of the river. The city that Constantine would plan to build would take 6 years to complete, and once done, the site would be consecrated by the Pope. The emperor also built a new hippodrome that was capable of seating 80,000 spectators. Constantine, in an effort to hurry the building of his new city, would completely subsidize the construction of any building in Constantinople. Constantine also brought back the Forum from the Republic era of Rome. The Forum that he would build can be seen on your right. It was called the Oval Forum of Constantine. Constantine would also start construction on the famous walls of Constantinople. These walls would stand for over 1,000 years until the Ottoman Empire would finally break them down. Constantine, according to legend, did not want the city named after him, and it wasn't until the clamoring of the citizens of Constantinople did he finally relent and name the city Constantinople. Today we have this idea of Constantine as a solely Christian empire. This view is hard to understand and can be very complex. Constantine erected several monuments to other gods, one even at his victory site at Milvian Bridge, the site where he supposedly saw Christ before he won a great battle. So why did Constantine erect these monuments? Was it to appease the majority of polytheist Romans. Constantine also passed many laws enshrining Christianity for Rome. One law that he passed was a law saying Sundays should be a rest for all people. He also stripped pagan gods off Rome's coinage and put symbols like the Chi Rho on them. Constantine also helped establish the precedent of the emperor having sway over the church. Constantine attempted to unite many groups of Christians, all who believed different things, into one church. One of the biggest divides in the early church was over Arianism. Arianism is the belief in Christianity that Jesus Christ was begotten by God the Father, and that the three elements of the Trinity, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, are all distinct and different things, with the two other entities being subordinate to God the Father. This controversy threatened to tear the early church apart. The other side opposing Arianism was the idea of the Trinity, that God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit are all one entity that work together in unison. This early split in the church is just one example of many splits that would happen in the future. Constantine solved this problem by calling a council in which he heard both sides, and then he made his ruling. He ruled against Arianism and had the Pope excommunicate them. He also seized their land and property. This first council is called the Council of Nicaea. Many more councils would follow to hammer out the early laws and code of the first Christian church. Many of these laws and code that we still follow today. For the most part, Constantine was a good and fair emperor. He was even made a saint by the church. But Constantine was just as ruthless as any past emperor before him. At this point, Constantine was getting older, and many thought his son, Crispus, would succeed him. His son was called Flavius Julius Crispus, and he was Constantine's eldest son. His life would come to a sudden end when his father put him on trial for treason and condemned him to death. The exact reason here is not known, as Constantine would have his son's name expunged from any records. Some speculate that the reason this execution happened is because Constantine preferred his other younger son, Constantine II, to be his heir. With Crispus's death, Constantine II was now Constantine's heir. Constantine, after this event, appointed Constantine II to be his junior emperor. But unlike the tetrarchy system that Diocletian created, the system that Constantine created was strictly hierarchical. Towards the last few years of his life, Constantine looked to war against the Persians, like so many other Roman emperors had. He sent his son to guard the border and prevent the Persians from more border raids. Constantine then sent a letter to the king of Persia urging him to treat his Christian subjects well. Constantine wanted to treat his campaign against the Persians like a crusade, by bringing bishops who would follow him everywhere. On this mission, he even planned to be baptized in the Jordan River. However, before the campaign started, it was called off when Constantine became sick in 337. Constantine could slowly feel his own death coming, and he had even planned his own burial in the Church of the Apostles. He did this because Constantine had come to believe that he himself was the 13th apostle. Soon after the feast of Easter in 337, he fell dangerously ill. He left Constantinople to be with his mother in a city that was named after her. He prayed here, and then he realized that he didn't have much longer. He was dying. He summoned his bishops and told them he wished to be baptized in the Jordan River, the place where Jesus was said to be baptized. His bishops knew this was impossible. There was no way Constantine could make it to the Jordan River in time. He picked his future biographer, Eusebius, to baptize him. As his condition worsened, he realized there would be no way to make it to Jordan. And as he lay dying, Eusebius baptized him in the villa called the Nectarin. Constantine then died a day later, on the last day of the feast of Easter. Following his death, his body was sent to the Church of the Holy Apostles. This was an expression of his final wish. Constantine had devoted his life to spreading Christianity. Now he got to rest with some of the most important Christians who ever lived. Constantine's final legacy is a complicated one. His father was a peasant with no noble blood that rose up to be the second in command of the Western Roman Empire. He was able to do this because of almost constant civil wars that broke out in Rome during this time. This created a power vacuum for him to fill. His son Constantine would help him on numerous campaigns before his death, and this son, who was born to an illegitimate mother, would take his father's position, win several civil wars against numerous skilled generals and tacticians, and along the way would discover his true purpose in the religion of Christianity. Constantine would stop the persecution on Christians that was widespread throughout the empire, even being baptized at his death. He even is still considered to this day to be a church by the Orthodox Church. Constantine founded a capital that would outlast him and the Roman Empire itself. He took an empire that was collapsing on itself and made it last 100 years longer. And his city of Constantinople would last for over 1,000 years. Constantine really lived up to the name Constantine the Great. This has been my presentation on Constantine the Great. I hope you got some enjoyment out of it because I put a lot of effort into it and it was a lot of work. These are my image citations for all the images you've seen in my video, and here are my sources.